Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Lord Exultant from the Champions of Slaanesh starter box for the Emperor's Children. As you can see, the first thing I've done is sprayed him white with some matte white spray from Colourforge. I've also not glued him to his base, as that will make things easier for painting his cloth. Next, I'm going to use some Black Templar's Contrast paint to paint any areas that are going to be black or a dark metal. I'm using a contrast paint just to speed things up a little bit, and if you are going to use the same technique that I'm going to, make sure that you give the areas at least a couple of coats. Once the paint is dry, I'm then going to use some Mechanica Standard Grey to start highlighting all of the black areas. And this will be followed by a little bit of Dawnstone for a lighter highlight. Next, I'm going to use some Emperor's Children to start painting any areas that are going to be pink. And then for the flesh on his leg, or the skin on his leg, I should say, I'm going to use some Cadian Flesh Tone. And then for the outside of that cloth that's dangling around him, I'm going to use some Screamer Pink. For the silver metal trim, I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel. I'm then going to coat everything from the Emperor's Children with some Carroburg Crimson. Once that wash is dried, I then relayered the Emperor's Children, avoiding any of the recesses. And then started the highlight with a 50-50 mix of Emperor's Children and Fulgrim Pink. And this was followed by an edge highlight of Fulgrim Pink just by itself. Just to add the skin, on the very edges, I'm just going to relayer the Cadian Flesh Tone. And then I'll highlight it with a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Rakarth Flesh. For the cloak, I'll relayer the Screamer Pink. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Pink Horror. And then finally, Pink Horror just by itself for an edge highlight. For the metal, I'm just going to quite simply relayer the Iron Hand Steel. I'll also use the Iron Hand Steel to paint the bolts on the leg. For the leather strap and his holster, I'm going to use some Catachan Flesh. And then for the darker metal, I'm going to use some Iron Warriors. I'm then going to paint the handle of the pistol with some Corvus Black. Then everything from the Catachan Flesh will receive a wash with some Nuln Oil. And while that dries, I'll use some Nurgling Green to paint all of the tassels and the top knot. And for his eye lenses, I'm going to use some Warpstone Glow. And then I'll give his eye lenses and the tassels a wash with some Beltan Green. And while that dries, for the inside of his cloak, I'm going to use some Zerus Purple. And this will receive a wash with some Druchii Violet. To highlight the Catachan Flesh, I'm going to use some Knight's Quester Flesh. And for those tassels, I'm going to simply just do a quick dry brush of the Nurgling Green. I'll then go back to the lenses and use a small bit of Moot Green. Then for all the areas that are going to be gold, I'm going to use some Retributor Armour, which I'll wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. While that dries, I'm going to relayer the Zerus Purple, which will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Zerus Purple and Genestealer Purple. This will be followed by an edge highlight of Genestealer Purple. Then, moving back to the gold, I'm going to relayer the Retributor Armour with some Retributor Armour. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Retributor Armour and Uruk Armour Gold. And then finally, Uruk Armour Gold just by itself. I'm then going to break out the Stormhost Silver, and I'm going to highlight the rest of the silver on the sharpest edges and the points, and I'm also going to do the tips of any gold. Then I'm going to glue the miniature to his base, and I'm going to paint the rocks he's standing on with some Dawnstone. After that, I'm going to use some Stirland mud to add some texture to the base. Once the texture paint has dried, I'm going to give both the rocks and the texture paint a dry brush with some Carrick stone. All that's left to do now is add a few tufts and paint up that rim. So for me, I'm going to use some Dryad bark, but you can choose any colour you like. And there we go, that's the Lord Exultant. I'm pretty certain I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. That's him finished. He's an absolute blast to paint. So much lovely sort of different colours than you would paint with various other armies, unless of course you're creating your own army. It didn't take too long either whatsoever, only coming in around about 4 hours. It's very important, however, to remember not to glue him onto his base, because otherwise it is a pain in the backside to try and paint around all that cloak. Thank you for watching, and if you use this guide, I really do hope you found it useful. And if you want to see more, there's plenty more on the channel. Just give the channel a subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.